Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending. I'm Laurie Nathan. I'm Director of the Mediation Program at the Koch Institute. It's a great pleasure to welcome Priscilla Hayner, who is an old and good friend of the Koch Institute. She's an expert on transitional justice. She's currently a member of the United Nations Mediation Standby Team. Members of the team are deployed throughout the world to assist with peace processes. And Priscilla specializes in issues of justice in peace negotiations. She's been involved most notably in the peace process for Yemen and Central African Republic, and prior to that involved in the Colombia negotiations and also the talks for Central African Republic. She co-founded the International Center for Transitional Justice in 2001, and in the same year published a really big book, big in the sense of influential, with over 1,300 Google Scholar citations. So that's a very influential book now in its second edition, published by Routledge. The second edition has some fabulous quotes praising the book, and there are many that one could read. I'm only going to read one. This is from Samantha Power. And I read this not because it's Samantha Power, but because it begins with a great line. At last, Priscilla Hayner has come along. Which applies also to her presence here at Notre Dame. At last, Priscilla Hayner has come along, supplying the first detailed survey of national and international experiences with truth commissions. She offers a stirring, trenchant, and nuanced account of the complex range of issues faced by those attempting to move forward while also looking backward. She writes about unspeakable truths and herself is not afraid to utter them, as she challenges some of our core assumptions about truth, forgiveness, justice, and healing. The challenge that Priscilla addresses in her new book, which is Here the Peacemaker's Paradox, Pursuing Justice in the Shadow of Conflict. The challenge is captured by the word paradox. And Priscilla will now address us and explain what the paradox is. So, over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. You'd be surprised how often I'm asked, what is the paradox? And it's especially disturbing after I've spoken for half an hour about the book. Ask me that question. So I realized I maybe haven't been explaining myself very well. So thank you for reminding me. I should make it very clear. It's you know, I'm not an alum of Notre Dame, but I always feel a bit like I'm coming home when I come here, because I've, of course, come over the years. And I have two special connections. One is, of course, not only my older, but my oldest sister, Anne, has worked here for many years. So, you know, once an older sister, always an older sister. So most things that I know I learned from Anne, starting from when I was pretty high. And the second is that I did a peace studies bachelor's degree at Earlham College, and George Lopez was my advisor at the time, way back before he came to Notre Dame. And kind of like an older sister, once an advisor, always an advisor. And there have been actually several, he may not be, I know he's in Colombia this week, so he's not here, he may not be fully aware of this, but there's been some key moments of decision and path choosing in my life that George sort of randomly made a phone call and said, have you ever thought about X? And I said, actually, X has never occurred to me. Like, for example, when I first wrote Unspeakable Truths, it had not occurred to me that maybe I should write a book on the subject that I had already been writing articles on and such. And he said, yeah, you should maybe write a book and you should maybe try to get a grant to do so. And it really wouldn't have come into my mind. So people like George Lopez and other, I'm sure many of you either have good advisors or are good advisors to others. It's extraordinary the impact it can have on one's life. So for those two reasons, I always have felt close to Notre Dame. And of course, the third is that the Koch Institute has been such a path-breaking institute and path-building institute for so long. And, you know, when I was at Earlham so long ago, the Peace and Global Studies program was relatively small. It's grown since, but there certainly was no Koch out there to sort of lead the way and do the kind of research and publishing that is happening here. And having looked at the website over the last few days, I have to say it's really impressive the amount of work that's coming out of Notre Dame in this field. It's really nice and very varied and diverse. So I looked back at the paragraph that I had been kindly asked to provide as to what I was going to talk about, and I saw that I said I was going to tell some untold stories. So I think I've signed myself up to that, and I want to keep to my offer, especially since it's not being webcast, which means I have more freedom to speak, which is always nice. And sometimes you have some limitations when you're in sort of policy circles around New York, and many things are webcast. And I have to say, you know, I'm not intending to speak from a sort of theoretical perspective in both senses of theoretical. I don't really do theory. So in that sense, although I hope one can pull theory from what I do. And it's also not theoretical in the sense of like what might be true. These are actually real problems that I and many others confront often. These questions around, especially when one looks at peace, justice, I don't want to say peace versus justice, but peace and justice, and how you can possibly work in a mediation, negotiations context to try to get both. This is definitely not a theoretical question, unfortunately, and there is also no good or easy answer. It's something that mediators out there are struggling with daily, and there's any number of current contexts where there may be ongoing peace negotiations, or they may be trying to move towards peace negotiations in the hope that they will be able to get to the table and have real talks, where everybody knows, in almost every one of those cases, everybody knows in the back of their mind that one of the difficult issues, not always the most difficult issue, but often it is the most difficult issue, is what are they going to do around the question of justice? What are they going to do when they're sitting down with the people who actually are assumed to have been responsible either directly or at a command level for quite atrocious crimes, often well-documented crimes now. And at the international level, it's pretty clear now to everybody, you just really can't offer amnesty and move on. That used to be true. It used to be true but uncomfortable, and then it became true but questionable, and now it's kind of, you know, everybody knows if the parties at the national level decide that the solution for them around getting to peace is just turning the page and giving a full blanket amnesty to everybody, everyone around them, the mediator and others, will tell them that's not going to last very long. It's probably going to be challenged at the national level, wherever you are. It probably contradicts their own constitution. And if any one of them travels internationally, there's a good chance that the law will catch up with them, either through an international court, if the International Criminal Court, for example, would have jurisdiction, or many countries, especially in Europe now, have what we call universal jurisdiction, where even if a crime didn't pertain to France or Belgium or Switzerland, they would have the jurisdiction to actually try people for crimes that took place overseas if they have the evidence, and if someone is physically passing through their country. So there's all kinds of ways why this is a difficult issue for many and in many different contexts. So I'll mention perhaps three before getting to some more sort of general points. Lori mentioned that I've been working recently on behalf of the UN and the standby team of mediation advisors in the Central African Republic, which is a very tough country, very poor, very unknown. If any one of you knows it, I'm happy. Most people say, where is that? And actually it's in Central Africa. It's a short conversation, but it is actually quite common that I'm asked that. And that's about as far as the conversation goes. But when you're there, you start getting infused with how difficult the whole set of challenges are there for a whole host of reasons. And the reason I was asked to be involved in the Central African Republic is because the UN, which has a large mission of 12,000 troops there, and is sort of keeping the country from exploding again. The UN is trying to envision what might it look like to have a justice vision, a justice package. They're about to sit down with the many different armed groups that exist. There's 14 or more armed groups for more serious political talks, which the African Union is leading. They've been creeping up and having sort of more intensive talks. But what's going to happen if some of the people who are leading these armed groups actually, their interest is to go into a government of national unity or whatever other kind of governmental position or ministry position they might have. That is not the same as going to prison. That's not really in their future career plan. And in addition, in the immediate sense, sort of oddly, there are some of those 14 armed groups, a few that are interested in demobilizing sooner rather than later, maybe even very soon. So if they go through a demobilization and disarmament program and go back to communities for reintegration, so that what they call EDR programs, what do you do then when some of them, as soon as they put down their gun, the communities are going to be pointing at them and saying, actually, we know those are the bad guys. I mean, maybe a lot of them were involved in some stuff, but there's some that are particularly bad. And the United Nations should be arresting them if the UN is in control of that area, or the government where they have control, they should be arresting them. This might be many people, and there is simply not the capacity to process all of them, but also what would that mean for other disarmament programs for all the other armed groups that are looking to do that potentially in the relatively near future? Why would they disarm and why would they give up their fight if they think, in fact, there's a good chance, especially the leadership, might be arrested? At the same time, nobody is expecting or suggesting that there should be an amnesty, except the armed groups themselves, who are quite interested in amnesty. But the government says absolutely no way, and the UN says, of course, no way, we would never support an amnesty for serious crimes. So I was asked to sort of set out, basically be a pen holder on, like, what would this look like? How could you have a DDR program in the immediate sense and have some sort of alternative path for people to give back, to do maybe community service, to engage with the community, to support victim recovery and returns of refugees in a way that would be acceptable to the communities, acceptable to the government, totally kosher under international law, and would be sort of enough to start stitching the country back together again. So those are the kinds of things in the Central African Republic we're now looking at, and it is not easy, very much a moving issue, so watch that space. The second is in Kenya, a place I wanted to mention. I was the human rights advisor to the Kofi Annan team in 2008, where Kenya was on absolute precipice of falling into what would have looked a bit like Rwanda, like just horrific killings based on along ethnic lines and lines, physical lines drawn throughout the countries to no-go areas for different ethnic communities. And they were really on the edge. I came in at the request of the Kofi Annan team to essentially arrive and 2 days later sit down with the two parties to the conflict, the two sides, the government and the opposition, and basically come up with some sort of justice solution, transitional justice solution. Because everyone, again, knew you can't walk away, even the immediate, what turned out to be over 1,000 people killed, much less the decades of legacy of authoritarian rule and lots of serious human rights violations that had taken place. You couldn't just walk away and say, well, you know, let's move on. They knew something had to happen, but they didn't know what. And in the interest of time, I'll be brief on this story, but when I did set, after consultations and speaking with as many Kenyans as I could in 48 hours, it was too short. But what was most interesting is when I did sit down with the two sides, and it was literally a square rectangle table, I was head, and one side was on this side and the other side was on that side. And when we got to questions around justice and proposals around having maybe a commission of inquiry, looking at post-election violence, and then maybe turning that into a longer-term justice mechanism, they each pointed across the table at the other side and said, no, we need to strengthen this justice arrangement. We need to make sure that people will be prosecuted, because what you guys did to us is absolutely unacceptable. And the other side said exactly the same thing back. And I have to say, it was a fascinating sort of psychological exercise to watch. And you'd actually be surprised how often the armed groups themselves don't quite see what their own side is doing, or they see it as justifiable in a strange way, that someone has to sometimes remind them, actually, what you did too will also be brought up to book. In that case, it helped considerably because both sides were quite keen to having a very strong arrangement. So we did strengthen the language to make sure that there was sort of criminal justice elements even from the start in the Commission of Inquiry. The third case I just wanted to briefly mention is that of Colombia. And I know Notre Dame is playing a very important role in Colombia now in monitoring implementation in a way that we've really never seen before around the world. And I'm not so involved now, although watching with great fascination. But during the course of the talks, I was asked by Norway to come in and help to coordinate a brainstorming, a brain trust essentially, of 7 people, partly internationals, partly Colombians, to get together pretty often. Every 6 weeks, we're coming from all over the world, and spend 2 days together, basically rolling up our sleeves and saying, okay, what might be the answer on justice? What's possible within the Colombian framework, what's politically possible, what's legally possible, and what should the talks perhaps be looking at? The talks in Havana were underway, and 2 of the 7 people in our group were actually legal advisors to the FARC at the time. So they were a direct line. So we were sort of an informal, we definitely weren't an official track, but we were an unofficial track alongside the official track. And we met about 13 times over the space of 2 years. Very intensive discussions, very confidential. We managed to keep it quite quiet, which was important because especially at the beginning, these issues were so sensitive. As anyone here who knows Colombia would know, it would have been all over the papers. And the kinds of ideas we were trying to flesh through, you don't want them in open air until you sort of work out, well, what is doable? And I have to say, over those 2 years, there were moments when some of us looked at each other and said, this might actually not be possible. There might not be a solution here. It was not evident what you could come up with in Colombia, which is legally very sophisticated. They really know what they're doing. They have deep roots in knowing human rights nationally and internationally. They're strongly committed to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. At the same time, even, or perhaps especially, the human rights advocates wanted this conflict to end. And they knew they couldn't just sort of throw the human rights book at the FARC, or for that matter, the leadership of the military and their allies in the paramilitaries. Of course, you know the story from there. Colombia did come up with a very interesting and novel arrangement. The process itself is what is very interesting in terms of getting there and how difficult it was. So when we look at these 3 and other kinds of examples, a few things stand out in terms of sort of what are we seeing. One is, not surprisingly, powerful people really don't like going to prison if they can help it. And it's true. What the FARC would often say to anyone that would listen is there's no armed group around the world that has sort of written its own, arrest warrant and walked into prison voluntarily. They don't give up their arms if they're going to prison. And actually, I think that's true. So it's hard to argue against that. And obviously, unfortunately, there's some logic behind it. The second is, as I already said, the armed groups themselves and the military, official armies as well, often feel justified in what they're doing. So it's hard for them to get their minds around the responsibilities that they hold. So sort of the sheepish is not like a trait that I would assign to any of these armed group leaders. They usually are pretty confident in their own, the rightness, the correctness of their own vision and their own actions. The third is that, as I have said, there's no one right way to do these things, to find the solution in these peace agreements. on the justice question. And that is actually uncomfortable to many people, and many people who are experts that we need to rely on to do this well. So for folks who are who are used to working on human rights or justice and transitional justice from a sort of legally, lawyerly perspective, it's uncomfortable that there's not really a black and a white, that there's lots of different ways to do something potentially well, but also potentially badly, and there's no clear lines in some of these areas. So if you're talking about prosecutions, we know like sort of what you're supposed to do. There's lots and lots of rules, and you should follow them, and that's very important. And I'm not saying prosecutions is off the table. I'm saying what do you do in addition to that, and then it becomes a little bit, you know, there's some flexibility there in a positive sense. But for lawyers, they can sometimes feel uncomfortable or feel like, well, that's not our work, that's somebody else's work, we'll stick only to prosecutions. Well, actually, it starts bumping into each other, the various mechanisms, so it's important to have them involved. For human rights advocates, equally, it's much easier to say justice for everybody who was involved in serious crimes. I agree with that principle, absolutely. But then when we get to the real world, we realize, well, how do we even think about that on a practical level, leaving aside the political resistance to that? And so then you start looking at like, well, what is acceptable in terms of having some sort of more modified, national specific, context specific answer? And when are these kinds of whatever, sometimes some people feel a compromises, when is it acceptable? When are we going too far on that? And then third, for UN and international experts and policymakers, the clear guidance which is there is relatively narrow. So there's clear guidance about not, for the UN anyway, for not providing support to amnesty for serious crimes. If national actors choose that, you can't prevent that, but you want to make very clear the UN does not support that. That's been a clear policy for close to 20 years about, actually. But beyond that, also, it's not so clear. So sometimes internationals such as the UN are asked to assist with, let's say, setting up a truth commission in a context where the commission itself is compromised, or it's being done for the wrong reasons to not do more serious sort of criminal justice efforts. So at what point do we have clear guidance from an international perspective as to where we go and what our policies are? So why is it that these things are so difficult? And I wanted to mention three quickly. One is that I think what we're seeing, in a sense, and fairly clear, is that I think our core principles and our priorities sometimes contradict. So if you see an awful conflict underway, and you could pick today amongst several in the front of the papers, you say, you know, our priority from an international perspective, if you can have any impact on this, is to stop the fighting, to stop the violence, and to stop having future victims. That's clearly a priority. At the same time, the same people would say an absolute core principle is you can't give up justice. You can't grant impunity for these crimes, just period. It's just not 2018. It's just not okay anymore. And then suddenly, at a practical level, you have a clash. So I have a friend, for example, who was doing a lot of work looking at what the policy is around the European Union on some of these transitional justice and peacemaking issues. And she came out, wrote a dissertation, and she was quite blunt and basically said, the European Union is absolutely self-contradictory. It has no clear policy because its policies do not line up together. They contradict. They have never all sat down together and said, people saying peace is a priority and people saying human rights and justice is a priority, they've never actually come together and say, well, what does this mean when we're trying to work on both things at the same time? I think it's something we all struggle with. I think we have to struggle with it, but we also have to recognize that's part of what's happening. The second is that the international reach of justice is getting stronger and reaching further. So this is a good thing, I think. And most people would agree with that if you have human rights interests in mind. The International Criminal Court is stronger and stronger. Obviously, it has lots of challenges, but for those that are following it, but its reach is broadening. There's other kinds of court, international or ad hoc courts that are also very important and have been in the past. And generally, there's a sense that international justice is something that one has to take into account. That's a good thing. However, the idea behind the International Criminal Court and its very inception was that if you set up an international court, then this will have a direct effect on deterrence. If you have a court that has the powers to hold people to account at the highest levels for the most serious crimes, then of course those people will stop committing those crimes because they'll feel the threat of justice. The long and short of it is, yes, sort of, but not as much as we hope, not as much as people hope that we're involved in the establishment of the ICC. Yes, people respond, their behavior changes when they see the ICC coming, and that's clear. Certainly my research shows lots of anecdotal evidence of it, but certainly enough anecdotes that convinces me where people are very clear. When they see the ICC looking at them, they change their behavior and they make it very clear that it's not them that's committing crime, their hands are clean. The problem is that their behavior then goes back once they realize the prosecutor's no longer paying attention. So then they'll slip back. So you can see that in lots of individual cases where as long as the International Criminal Court prosecutor is really paying close attention, actually you can have a positive effect. But the prosecutor, can't be everywhere at the same time with equal attention and equal force. So then things have slipped back. The second challenge with the strengthening of international justice is that we have to ask, is there flexibility as to how those justice mechanisms are applied, how they do their work? I argue that there is some flexibility. It's written into the treaty that established the ICC, the Rome Statute, which specifically says that the prosecutor of the ICC should not take up a case if it is not in the interests of justice to do so. Interests of justice is a phrase that is not defined, and there's lots of fascinating debate as to what that means. I'm happy to say most legal scholars and practitioners have said interests of justice clearly is intended to be a pretty broad term. It gives the prosecutor the opportunity to look at, ongoing peace talks, timing, are there people sitting at the peace table you don't want to chase back into the bush by coming out with an arrest warrant for them, not, at the same time, etc. But the ICC itself is relatively resistant to having a more flexible approach or political approach to that. So I think we need to work that through more in terms of what the impact is of having a stronger international justice regime. And then finally, as I said earlier, because we're not talking about just trials, we're talking about judicial and non-judicial forms of justice. So truth commissions, reparations for victims, other forms of reform, removing people through screening and vetting, removing them from the army if they've committed serious crimes, a whole range of forms of justice which are victim-focused and holding perpetrators to account. Because these are both legal and non-legal, and because they implicate many moving parts and many different actors, we start, if we're not conscious from the beginning at looking at those connections, we start potentially coming up with a bit of a complicated situation, because we can have different institutions digging up different kinds of evidence under different standards, for example. And if lawyers are thinking, well, we're only looking at prosecutions, and then truth commissions are digging into evidence, or even undertaking forensic examinations and not sharing the information or not sharing it appropriately, you start having a bit of a mess. So I think part of the challenge and part of the difficulty is it is complicated because it looks broadly at justice. It has to, and the demand from victims also is to go beyond criminal justice. And that can present special challenges. Maybe I'll just end with apologies for going on for some time by apologizing, because I think I labeled this talk, is justice impossible after conflict? Is the name of it?
Yeah.
It's just impossible after war. And I should have said, how is justice possible after war? Because of course it has to be possible. It's a matter of how we get there and what the solutions are. And as I said before, at least once or twice, it's not evident how to get there, but there have to be solutions, and there have to be creative solutions in each place. The paradox is, to get to Laurie's original question, if you look up what a paradox is, it's essentially trying to do two things at the same time, both of which is impossible to do together. So something which is both essential and impossible at the same time is a bit of a paradox. And that's the sort of general way to state it. For a peacemaker, it's a paradox because you have to have justice to get to peace for all kinds of different reasons. To have a more firm basis of peace, to oblige with international law, etc. Justice is seen as necessary for peace in all different kinds of ways. The more you, as a peacemaker, try to push for justice, if you're sitting down with the people who are actually making the war, the further away that peace gets. That is the paradox, because the very people that are the war makers don't want that justice, or they don't want that kind of justice. They only want a certain limited kind of justice. So the more you push for, there needs to be justice here, because we know these crimes have been committed and we know you all are responsible, the less likely those very people are going to decide to actually say, okay, let's bring the war to a close. So it's a real difficulty, because mediators know you can't ignore this issue, and they also know it's very, very hard to resolve this issue. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
So there we have the paradox. Peace and justice are not inherently, intrinsically incompatible. Many societies thrive by virtue of having both, but there's certain contexts, such as in peace processes, where they appear to be in tension with each other, such that one is forced, or believed to be forced, to make hard choices, and at least to have to compromise justice. I say that from a mediator's perspective. So I have a normative bias in the debate on the resolution of this paradox. I invite your comments. Your disagreements are welcome, as are your questions. And as always at these seminars, we encourage our students to speak first and loudest.
Students first, Derek.
Yeah, so let's just see. And you're welcome, not welcome, you're encouraged to introduce yourself.
Over here.
Okay. Yeah, my brother, you're welcome.
Okay. Sorry, my name is Nadozie. I'm a Master of Global Affairs student from Nigeria. Last week, the Humans of New York page was profiling what happened in Rwanda, kind of commemorating the tragedy. And one of the posts was profiling President Kagame, and he talking about a puzzle, which I think is paradox still again, and how some people said he could have put everybody in jail. But then people felt, why are you forcing us to forgive? And I've just been wondering, where do you place forgiveness in this whole picture of justice and peace? Where does forgiveness fit into the paradigm? Especially if the people want to forgive and the international community still wants to hold the perpetrators to account in order to deter future occurrences.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions and then Priscilla. And one can broaden that slightly beyond forgiveness to include the broader notion of reconciliation,
yes,
which is both amorphous and politically potent intervention that's required. There was a student,
Yeah, my name is Nate, and my question is, you commented how the UN has kind of a bright line around no amnesty for serious crimes, but beyond that, it's fuzzy. Do you see the international community moving, but that wasn't always the case, so do you see the international community moving toward any other bright lines?
One more, yeah.
I'm just curious about, justice in a transitional sense in a lot of ways, as stated. But sometimes I feel like we limit our views of justice to a retributive framework versus a restorational framework. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how people are potentially imagining justice in the future. That's why you don't have to speak retributive.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. All excellent questions. I think forgiveness and reconciliation potentially is central to what we're talking about, but the challenge is that that needs to be defined by the national community, the national population in any given context. So if there's a country that there's strong public support for actually we need to move on, we need to forgive, we need to bring people back into the community, back into the fold, then that can be built into essentially part of a program and can be very central to that. There's other places where there's absolutely no sort of popular support for that idea. And then it just sort of try to force that from as an outsider advising or giving ideas, it just wouldn't make sense. So from a practical point of view, that needs to be defined at the national level. And the challenge with reconciliation generally is that it's referred to mean so many different things, and it can take on so many different meanings on the ground as well. So we could probably all think of examples where for us, we have in mind reconciliation of a certain kind. People coming back to a community and the community receiving them back, talking through crimes that took place and coming to terms with that. Having a truth commission that has a positive impact of people being able to talk about things. There's various kinds of things we might think about as reconciliation, but that can be very, very different in different contexts. So I'm always a little bit shy about framing this work as reconciliation because it presumes a certain kind of definition to what that is. So where it's organic to a particular place, context, I certainly would encourage it and support it and work with that and try to understand that. But I think we also need to be sober about not trying to think that there's one approach. Even, for example, I've worked in the field of transitional justice for many years before I started working more in peace mediation. And there was an assumption, which I'm not sure was a correct assumption, which is that if you undertake all of these measures, prosecutions, restorative justice measures, truth commissions, reparations for victims, that this will lead to reconciliation. That may or may not be true. And I think we've been maybe a little bit simplistic in a sort of a general way about that. To be honest, I think it's a field that needs a lot more work, a lot of sort of more hardcore, like, okay, let's really get under this. How is it defined in different places? And what is it that we can do that's maybe more helpful around reconciliation or around, as you say, forgiveness? Okay, the question of the red lines, and as you say, there's red lines now for blanket amnesty for serious crimes. And it's a good question. Are the red lines going to extend further? I think that was essentially what your question was. Do I see them extending to other things? It's possible. And I don't know if that will be a good thing. And I say this because it seems to me that there are some areas that still aren't very clear in international law that has allowed what I would call positive flexibility, or allows some room for maneuver, so if you look at Colombia and you start looking at other places, at the end of the day, the essence of the solution in Colombia, and kind of the only solution that anyone could find, was the one area where there was flexibility was what's required in law, nationally and internationally, in terms of punishment. So the penal regime, if you ask Human Rights Watch, which has a very strong and clear and legally based view on human rights, and they know Colombia, they know everywhere, say what is the requirement in terms of how many years of jail one needs to comply with the requirement to punish someone? And the answer is, there is no clear answer to that. We don't know. There's no clear jurisdiction on that. The ICC has never said that. From an international, I mean, they have their own punishment standards, but it's not applicable at the national level. That, I think, is a positive thing. If you required, if the constraints became even more narrow in terms of the punishment regime, and maybe it is a direction that we're going, but if it is, I think it's going to be even more difficult. As somebody in Colombia said, in a context where the ICC was being perceived as being a bit too interventionist in Colombia at certain periods during the peace talks, and there were various possible solutions being floated, and the ICC was basically shutting them down and saying, you can't do that. We think it's not okay. We decided it's okay. Whereas Colombian lawyers thought it was okay. So it wasn't like it was a clear legal answer in any case. But there was one smart Colombian lawyer and human rights advocate who basically published an op-ed saying, essentially, if you, the ICC, keep going down this road, you're trying to suggest that a negotiated peace is becoming illegal, that it's actually impossible to end a war except through violent means. And that can't be the purpose of the ICC. So it was quite a startling moment. And it sort of encapsulated, sort of a lot of the reactions in Colombia is we need to find a way out here. So it's a good question what you're putting. I don't know the answer. That's the one thing that springs to mind as I'm not sure it would always be a positive thing to have actually even more rigid requirements in some areas. And then in terms of retributive justice and restorative justice, you're absolutely right. There's a particular challenge right now, I find, because when one talks about transitional justice in a lot of contexts, people think that means everything but retributive justice. So they think it's not the prosecutions, it's everything else. And then you start getting into really sort of complicated sort of conversation. Well, no, I mean, you don't want to spend too much time trying to repair that misunderstanding because you're trying to actually talk about the practical questions. This happened recently in the Central African Republic case where there was a lot of confusion. And there was no intention to suggest that all of the various retributive justice options weren't on the table, but what else could be combined with that? The idea of restorative justice is starting to be brought in, not often talked about as that. And in fact, I think that would be a positive development if we did that more, or if the field of transitional justice were starting to take that up more and learn from the domestic examples where restorative justice has been very consciously applied. Because in a sense, we're sort of stealing ideas like that, but not perhaps putting together the package entirely, where you're really thinking about, okay, so how are you really addressing the needs of the victim or the needs of the community, and through often through a conversation or a dialogue. So it's from at least my perspective, from where I sit in the international sphere, it's still a bit lonely in terms of people not referring to that word much. The ideas are usually quite attractive, but it hasn't, I think, it hasn't been fully transferred over in a way that perhaps could be useful.
Thanks, Priscilla. Yes, please.
So thank you very much for your presentation. I first met you in New York when you were with ICTJ and brought us out there as a student of Prague. So I was very inspired by your work, and then I went on to doing transitional justice work as well as a result of your influence.
Excellent.
Under the guidance of Juan Mendez.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So I'm going to begin by disagreeing with you on this one topic. You said at one point that you found that the eyes of the prosecutor, when it's on a particular conflict, that seems to be the most deterrent force, or one of the deterrent forces. But having worked with NGOs on the ground in Rwanda during the genocide, also in Congo and in Darfur, I've seen that the presence of NGOs, perceived as being the extension of the prosecutor, wrongly in most cases, but in some cases complicit, because some NGO members have gone on to testify or present evidence, and that was the case with the genocide in Rwanda. Sometimes our presence alone seems to be a dissuasive force. And then I wanted just to add one question. I worked on 3 different mediation efforts in Central African Republic in 2014 to Some of them involved disarmament, the PK5 Muslims with Sangari, so then the French forces that were there, working out some sort of engagement and rules between them. Another one involved rules of engagement among the Antabalaka, asking them what they think the rules of law should be in their conflict. So basically asking them, what do you want the others to do to your forces or your children, your family? What do you think the rules should be? And then coming to an agreement, which most of the time it came to align perfectly with law, international rules of law, under the Geneva rules of law. So those are things we were involved in. And the last one was more recently, just 9 months ago in Buar with the 3R and their work with the Antabalaka. And again, talking with them about what they feel will be justice, because a lot of them are willing to put down arms, but a lot of groups on the ground are saying, well, until the stores are restored, until the Muslims get their stores back, they're not going to feel like justice has been done. And the Christians who are occupying those stores say, well, feel like with Antabalaka, with their heroes. So my basic question here is, how do you reconcile the notion, on the ground notions, of the feeling that peace has already been moved forward through local level mediations? The image is almost as if you have small insects working on laying down the grass, and then an elephant comes along and steps on it. The elephant being the international community coming with the international mediators, while on the ground, the insects were already trying to do their own work and feeling like that was moving forward towards either restorative or another form of feeling that there is justice there. How do you reconcile the two?
Great. So this is another tension between the international and the national and the local. One or two others? Yeah.
A question that sort of branches off of that and goes a little more meta. I come from a background, Robert Tom, I'm a visiting research fellow at the CROC, and I come from a background in Latin American studies. Spent a long time myself studying sort of Latin Americans' contributions to our understanding of colonialism and coloniality, and I'm wondering, you have this complicated position of representing the UN in the Global South, right? So maybe these might be the similar answers to these two questions, but I wonder if you can tell us about an occasion when you had to grapple with the coloniality of your own position and how you did it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So Josephine, and then I'll take the colleague at the back. So Josephine.
Well, I think my question is a bit related to what has been asked before. It relates to the complementarity mechanism that exists within the ICC, and whether there has been any move in their position towards what is considered as the national level opening investigations and maybe kind of not prosecutions but other types of justice. So does the ICC consider that kind of alternative, restorative or restorative oriented initiatives as part of what they should consider when they decide to intervene or not, on the basis that there is something open or not under this complementarity rule?
Yeah, that's clear. Thank you. And then the colleague right at the back.
Hello, my name is Trevor, Uganda. I think there's been a lot of rhetoric from African leaders about their intention to pull up the ISIS. Many of them citing threats to the sovereignty of their countries, among many other reasons for why those people are captain being party from statutes. What worries African citizens like myself is that there's not been built in capacity, both regional and continental, to sort of perform the functions that the ISIS is currently trying to perform. So we have an African Court of Justice that has almost been ineffective. That's been attributed to so many reasons. But I ask this because one of the points you made was that the reach of international justice has grown over time. But I think that the further that reach has grown, the more resistance towards international intervention, the restoration of peace and promotion of justice and human rights has also grown as countries feel more threatened. Yes, in fact, not countries, but as leaders feel. I wonder what your take is on the position that many African leaders are taking. For example, in Burundi, there is looming disaster there because of President Nkurunziza's attitude towards leadership and the bickering conflicts in the country. And do you think the international good enough job in being a direct intervener as opposed to building capacity of institutions locally. We can cite many cases. Kenya 2008, 2013 as well. The country, and even 2017, was on the verge of violence. South Sudan, when they broke from Sudan, we thought there was hope for a peaceful regime in Sudan. Right now, South Sudan is in trouble. Central African Republic erupted. Cameroon is on fire. And we go on and on. Do you think the international interveners have ignored what might be most important, building capacity, and paying more attention to being direct interveners, that is, restoring peace and positive global ties to sustain that peace?
Thank you. So there are at least 3 books in the answer to the last 4 questions.
And look, we're out of time. Oh, that's great.
So in your
I thought there was like an unwritten part of the contract that the questions would get easier actually as they went on, but they didn't. Yes. So unfortunately, there is limited time, so I'll try to be brief but direct. In terms of the role of NGOs, be they national or local or a combination, absolutely there's a dissuasive effect. Might be an understatement, actually. I think they play a very, very important role. I mean, the difference between having nothing and basically no official witnesses and having NGOs that are around and about, often putting themselves at risk, is a huge difference. And ICC isn't present in that way, right? As a witness, so there's just a different role that they play. And one of the pieces of being a dissuasive effect as an NGO, I think, is because they know that information is being kept, right? So it's partly like, okay, if we do this, people are going to know because they're watching. So maybe it's partly an extension of like a threat of accountability in a positive sense. It's not just reporting, but it's actually like we're going to hold people to account here. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think the role of the ICC, to get back to sort of, I think the heart of your question, the role of the ICC in terms of deterrence is quite different and quite usually not intended to be this originally, but usually much more focused. So putting in a statement in a strategic moment, in a strategic place to say we are watching, then it can have an effect if done well. But that doesn't replace at all the other continual work by others. And in terms of, right, so in the Central African Republic, as you say, there's efforts, there have been efforts, and there's certainly efforts now to have these local level arrangements, and then also a national process with internationals and all the neighboring states involved. And it's complicated, and I actually don't know how it's going to work out in terms of how that national effort, how this is going to play out, especially because you have all the armed groups together and they have different interests, obviously, coming from very different places. It's complicated because most of the armed groups are not fighting the government, they're mostly fighting each other, if anything, or just fighting the population in a sense, taking over land and resources. However, it does seem, but sounds like you're more of an expert than I am on CAR, for sure, that the local arrangements that are being worked on, as important as they are, they're not going to resolve a bigger question, right? To actually get a lot of the groups to disarm and to come up with a political arrangement that is right and is acceptable and good and positive and actually gets people back into one society together again. I think that can't be done except by some sort of national political arrangement. Hopefully, in addition to, and not squishing the local agreements that you mentioned. So coloniality, was that the word you used? So it's interesting. As an American, I have had very mixed relationships to places like that. So you said you worked a lot in the Latin American arena. Obviously, in Latin America, especially Central America, the U.S. has played its role there, and that you have to take that into account as you do your work there in all kinds of ways. So I've been involved there in transitional justice kinds of contexts, and that's it's one of the important factors behind many conversations, right? The role that the U.S. has played, the information it has, the power it has, the force it has. Very different in Liberia, where, you know, in Liberia, when I went there, people said they consider themselves to be the 51st state. And I think they would have been surprised if I said, actually, most people I know don't realize that Liberia would consider itself to be the 51st state, much less there's a special relationship between the U.S. and Liberia. They would have been shocked and quite disappointed if I had said that. But they really considered, you know, I joked with them that I was their cousin because, you know, they really felt like they were closely connected to the U.S. because of the history there in a positive way compared to many other places. And also the responsibility that the U.S. had there and had during the time of the peace talks and the end of the conflict there, which is its own particular history, but it has a very, very different relationship there than what I would have felt in, for example, in Latin America. But perhaps we can also talk more off, you know, afterwards if you're interested in more specific things. This next question was, what was the next question? Right, exactly. So the ICC, in terms of whether it sees itself as playing more of a restorative justice role, especially given its complementarity regime, I think essentially was what you were asking. I haven't seen that, and even in a more narrow sense, the ICC has said it doesn't see itself as being, even in terms of providing training on a judicial level, it doesn't sort of what we would sometimes call positive complementarity, like actually helping national actors. Generally, it doesn't quite see that that's its place, as important as that work is. And taking that beyond to sort of thinking about restorative justice, I think that would be a step too far from what I have seen and heard in ICC. I can't speak for the ICC in any sense, but that would be my instinct. And then finally, our colleague from Uganda in the back. It's true. I think the resistance to the ICC has been important in the sense that there's been, you know, 2 or 3 states at different times that have said that they were intending or thinking about leaving. And there's obviously been a sort of an undercurrent of resistance and an undercurrent of serious misunderstanding about the ICC in Africa and globally. I can't quite tell if that's driven by people who have an interest in that resistance. So the powers that be, I think, have been increasingly nervous. You would think that there would be a positive reaction to the fact that the international community is committing to justice, and there's been more cases in Africa for sure, although many of the cases that the ICC is looking at but hasn't looking at quite seriously, but hasn't opened official investigations. Many of those are not in Africa, but that sort of has missed, the conversation, I think, there. So in a sense, I think the role of the ICC in Africa and the resistance to it, in a sense, shows the very strength that the ICC potentially has, because the more it has been involved, the stronger the resistance has been. But there's also been many civil society actors and human rights actors that have been very, very supportive of it. So I think the fact of the resistance is not fully, as I said, it is important because it's there, but it's not fully, representative of what Africans across the board feel towards justice for their own leaders. So I think we have to keep that in perspective.
Great, but the point, I think, nonetheless, that the critique of the ICC from Africa is undermined somewhat, whatever its validity, by the failure of the continent to develop its own mechanisms for respecting human rights, protecting human rights, and dealing with justice. I think there's a hand somewhere. Yeah.
I'm going to PhD student, also an Air Force officer, and I'm just thinking a lot about military victory versus negotiated settlements. And in some ways, I guess the question is, do you think that solves the paradox? And Victor can put it in, obviously, there's plenty of cases where a Rwanda, it's very one-sided justice or so on. But does that really solve the problem? And I was also thinking of the Sierra Leone case, where it seems like maybe there was more of an even-handed approach, even though there was, I would say, a pretty clear victory with UN and British troops. What your thought is on solving the paradox or the differences, qualitative differences between military victories and negotiated settlement?
Yeah, great question. If not, we'll treat that as the last question, and you can also make any wrap-up comments if you wish.
Good. I think it doesn't actually fully resolve the paradox. And I would point to Sri Lanka, very sadly, today. So there was a military victory in Sri Lanka, and justice has been on the table ever since and moved very slowly. And now, as of 5 days ago, there's sort of a de facto coup-ish, not exactly military coup, but the president dislodging the prime minister and putting in his own. And the person he put back in is the person who was responsible for those very, very serious violations at the end of that military victory quite a number of years ago. So we have, sort of look at that. And over the last years, where there's been slow progress on what was sort of an initial agreement from Sri Lanka, a commitment to the UN and Human Rights Council in Geneva, that they would undertake various justice measures, sort of a transitional justice package, and very slow progress. And then you start hearing from the Sri Lankans over the last years, it's like, part of the reason that progress has been slow is because if they had, they say, or they claim, if they had taken steps more rigorously, there would have been a backlash by the very people that had committed the crimes that will be up for election in another year and a half or so, I think. And that there's a fear that basically those guys not only will not be justice, will come back into power. So now we actually have that already. It's not actually clear how this is going to shake out, because now there's sort of 2 prime ministers that are claiming power at the same time in Sri Lanka this week. But it's a sort of a striking example. And I was talking with some people over the weekend, and some people say, well, that's why there should have been justice faster, because that would have taken care of the fact that you have the most responsible people coming back to power, because they would have been held to account. And then other people say, actually, that wasn't possible. They tried, and the resistance was so much, they thought they could get there through sort of a slow motion approach. Really difficult, but it's sort of a classic, and in a context where, as I said, it was a military victory. Usually the problem with military victory is you have victor's justice, and that's what you have. And that's also a problem, because then you usually have a lot of resentment and sort of a one-sided justice. I mean, this goes way back to, Nuremberg and elsewhere, where, it's also commonly.
We have a late-breaking intervention from Asha.
I'm a historian, so I have a question about the future. I mean, the argument that you are making, I think, is based on historical observation of changes in international norms, and hence you have the paradox, the growing importance of considering justice in these cases of mediation, post-conflict or within conflict, attempts to reach a settlement. When we think about the future, or even the present, and the concern about the transformation in the international order, the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, challenges within the United States, of the norms that your book articulates, have we reached actually the peak? Maybe the paradox might be waning in 5, 10 years?
Waning in the wrong direction, I presume,
Yeah.
is what you're suggesting. Yeah. I was pondering that, not as that and such, but sort of thinking about how does this really fit? I mean, it's hard to talk about these issues without putting it in the current context, right? Like, what does all of this mean for today? I mean, there's so much going on, and it's needing to go in the wrong direction in so many different places. And that sense of like, are we tipping and going back in all kinds of ways, human rights, et cetera, I think is an important question. Essentially, the question in this field is about whether human rights has seen its sort of heyday, and it's pulling back, and that includes accountability, it includes standards and practices, it includes, the international community, certain parts of the international community setting a standard. that's not so clear. I mean, I don't want to put my vote on the negative side of that column, but obviously there's all kinds of reasons to be concerned as to where that's going. And that will affect directly, you know, this whole round, of course. Having said that, I think despite the weakening in practice and in policy from key states, there have been enough, I think, advances in law and in standards, UN and various other institutions, that I think we've made sort of a good amount of progress that you can't just sort of wish away. So yes, things are feeling pretty unstable right now, but I don't think that we'll lose ground quickly and sort of on the fundamentals. I think there's enough in place that's solid. That's my instinct. I mean, despite a lot of things seem to be going in the wrong direction.
Okay, in closing the meeting, I'm going to throw out a response to that as well with a slightly more positive answer. I don't think this paradox is going away because it's played out not only at the international level, but at the domestic level. It's a fight that we have as local actors and as political parties and as civil society groups in the countries that are transitioning from war to peace. We are confronted with this tension between peace and justice, and we take different positions. I think also at the international level, and this is partly a response to one of the earlier questions, the UN position is no blanket amnesty for the so-called mass atrocity crimes. So war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc. That's unlikely to be diluted in the future because it's a position that derives from international law on the conduct of warfare. It may be the case that the boundaries are not going to be pushed further, but I don't think they're going to be rolled back. So that was my 2 cents worth. I'm using my role as the facilitator meeting. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you for your enthusiastic contribution, and thank you most of all to Priscilla. That was a fantastic contribution, very enlightening. We have book signing outside the venue. So those of you that wish to get a book signed, buy a book, pursue questions of coloniality, you're most welcome to do that. Thank you all very much, and thank you to Priscilla.